Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been wonderful having the opportunity to visit South Africa for the first time. I'm going to start by posing to you all that apart from us all being part of the legal industry, and in some way, shape or form being lawyers, being part of the profession, we ultimately all have one thing in common. And that one thing is that we are all here today to drive an increase in customer engagement. What does that mean? Customer engagement is really at the core and at the very heart of why we're all here talking about how we can add value. Whether you're a legal technology provider or a software provider like Juta, your goal as a software provider is really to drive customer engagement so that you can sell your product. For those of us like myself that work in-house in a legal team, you want to drive customer engagement because your customers are your business stakeholders. So working at Hester, I run a legal team in an in-house organisation, and my business stakeholders are the marketing team, the product team, the financial advice team, the investments team. And I want to drive engagement from them so that I can do my job. Because my job as an in-house lawyer is to mitigate legal risk. So if I can't drive increased engagement from those business stakeholders, I can't do my job. If we're an external law firm, why do you want to drive customer engagement? We've already heard a little bit about it earlier from Andrea, and that is the fact that you want your billables up. You can't bill clients if clients aren't engaging with you. You're wanting to sell a legal service. So with all of that in mind, this is what we're going to talk about today. How do we drive customer engagement by ensuring we redefine how we, every one of us here in this room, add value? I'll start by talking a little bit about, I think, where you need to start. And at the very root of it is, why did we all decide to join or go into the profession as lawyers? If you all take a step back, and there are varying age groups in the room, if you think back to why it was that drew you to the law, whether as a software provider or as a lawyer or as someone at the bar, what were your motivators for wanting to pursue a career in the law? So I'll investigate that a little bit with you this morning. And that defines really our motivators, our drivers, what we all want to get out of being lawyers, being professionals, why we're sitting here today. From there, I think it's important, in order to be able to think about value, we need to touch upon what Kamal's already mentioned, the world of disruption. I think it's probably one of the most overused words at the moment. What does disruption actually mean? What are we talking about? Disruption isn't just about technology. It's the wider environment that we're all operating in today. So we'll spend a bit of time thinking about and talking about what that actually means too. And then thirdly, why is it customers engage us? How can we redefine value without firstly thinking back again at why is it that we get engaged, whether as a tech provider, whether as a lawyer, in-house or external? What is it that customers want from us? Why do they approach us in the first place? So we'll look at those fundamental principles, and then what I propose is to then look at the framework. What should be the framework that we use to ensure that we can redefine our value in this legal industry that we're all operating in now? So this is something I am very passionate about. I do this in my day-to-day as part of the introduction Kamal's given me. I am the Executive General Counsel at Hester Super Fund in Australia. By way of introduction, Hester is I think you call them pension funds here, and we manage just short of $50 billion for Australian individuals in the health and community services sector. So nurses, doctors, all kinds of aged care workers and healthcare workers. My world each day is ensuring that as General Counsel and in leading my team, we are always driving value to each of our business stakeholders. I think it can sometimes be a little bit different because we're not there to drive billables. And so in many ways, I certainly find it very challenging to ensure that we can define what our value is to those business stakeholders who oftentimes just want the legal sign-off. They just want to be able to do whatever it is they want to do. Oh, Jordan, I just want to get that marketing sign-off. I need to do that campaign. We want to launch that product. Why are you being a pain? The role of legal is really important in-house and very difficult to prove our value because we're playing defence. So with that in mind, let's make a start. Why did we all pursue a career in the law? I'm going to talk about, I think, key 6 reasons that I think would summarise in general why each and every one of us pursued a career in the law. Generalisation, yes, but I think broadly they'll capture everything. When I was 12 years old, my father bought a dial-up modem. Back in the day, for those of you who know what dial-up internet is. My sister and I went with my father to this local boutique computer store selling computer hardware. Those stores don't exist in this day and age anymore. And we bought this modem, so excited, took it home, couldn't wait to have the internet. Modem didn't work. It's faulty. No internet. So off we trudged back to the store and spoke to the store owner. And I watched this heated exchange between my father and the store owner about why it didn't work. My father's of Cambodian Chinese descent, so he didn't speak very good English, nor was he aware of what he could really do in that situation. The store owner, in short, said, no, go home, try it again, it's not faulty, it's fine. So off we trudged back home, tested, tried over and over again. Didn't work. Modem was 100% faulty. Back we went, and this time the exchange was much more heated. And my 12-year-old self knew in my gut that there was something not right about how this man was speaking to my father. That exchange ended with my father being told, too bad, doesn't work, not my problem, there's the door, out you go. I was furious, absolutely livid that my father was being treated in this way, but he didn't know what to do and he was just going to let it go. But my angry 12-year-old self said no. So I asked my father, will you take me to the local library where there is free internet, and I'll try and see if there's a way, if I can find some help from someone. So long story short, I found a consumer law action group and they were able to get involved and got us a refund. Point of that story is, I think when I look at it in retrospect, what happened in that scenario was I had become an accidental advocate for someone who didn't speak English, who didn't know the legal system, who didn't understand what their rights were. I had become an advocate for that, for my father. And I think that is a very common reason that some people decide that they want to join the legal profession. They want to be able to be an advocate for those that need an advocate. A second reason, which perhaps sounds much less noble, is money. Some people, rightly or wrongly, think that lawyers get paid a truckload of money. And some of us will laugh in the room because some will think that that's not the case and others will think that yes, it is. And that is a key reason. Third reason, prestige. Undoubtedly, and again it depends on who you ask, there is an aura of prestige about being in the profession. There's a respectability, an elitism, a nobleness about being a lawyer, and that perhaps is also what has attracted us to being in the law. A fourth reason, and I think the law nerds in the room will really appreciate this because I certainly count myself as one, is the intellectual stimulation that comes with looking at the law. I did my law masters a few years ago and I remember there was this one subject, contract interpretation, that I did. And it was absolutely fascinating learning about how one case turned upon how 3 words in a contract were drafted and reading the judgment that the judge had written in his judicial reasoning for how that came to be. Absolutely fascinating stuff to perhaps only the people in this room. Another reason is, similar to what I've alluded to on advocacy, people wanting to be absolute advocates of pure justice. There is an innate sense that we want to further the ideals of justice and that we want to be able to do that by being in the law. And finally, as a blanket all kind of catch-all, I think some of us think that if we're in the law, we're able to help others. And that is a big reason for why we may decide to pursue our careers in the law. So those are the 6 umbrella reasons. For illustrative purposes, I've put up some pictures here to make my point. Those of you may or may not remember, Atticus Finch, for me, the absolute literary personification of what justice and lawyers are meant to stand for, in his dogged, absolute, unrelenting defence of Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird. You have Nelson Mandela here, who is, of course, known to all of you as the father of South Africa. And he, amongst all his amazing achievements, did many things, but we could probably sum up in his short career in the law and then other things that he did achieve. He was all about pursuing and fighting for social justice. How many of you are familiar with that third face? You'd be forgiven because he's only gained recent fame in Australian circles. That third face there is Kenneth Hayne, and he's a former Justice of the High Court of Australia. He's gained recent fame in Australia and Australian legal circles in particular because he was the appointed Commissioner for the Royal Commission into Misconduct in the Banking and Financial Services industry. Quite the mouthful. Financial services encaptures, in a similar way, I think here in South Africa, banking, wealth management, financial services, superannuation, insurance, pension products, an enormous industry in Australia, just as it is here in South Africa. And the reason I point him out is to talk about my next point around the environment that we operate within. The impact of the Royal Commission in Australia was enormous. It ran for a period of about 12 months and had 8 to 9 public rounds of hearings that focused on key organisations in each of those industries within financial services that I've described. And the Commission was out for blood. It was all that was reported in the newspapers for 12 months, and enormous findings of misconduct. By way of example, you may not be able to read all the fine print here, but really what I want you to focus on is that red line. Because that red line represents the share price of AMP over the period of the Royal Commission, the 12 months, and it's largely halved. AMP as an organisation is one of the largest, most trusted financial services institutions in Australia, and they provide products in every realm of financial services, one of the biggest names in Australia. They provide financial products to all everyday consumers, retirement benefit products, insurance products, everything you can think of under the sun touching financial services. That is AMP. And the Royal Commission found over 200 counts of misconduct. Doing things like charging people for services never rendered, financial advice never provided, charging account fees for a prolonged period of times for consumers that were dead. Absolutely horrific. And what this has done is, as I've suggested here, it has put a really huge spotlight on the enormous seismic shift in consumer expectations of all the institutions they deal with. Now, why is this relevant to us today? It's relevant because it is the operating environment that we're in, the disruption that we're all talking about. It's a fallacy to think that disruption is only about technology and only about AI and the changing world. What I think we're really needing to talk about when we think disruption is the concept of VUCA. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the phrase VUCA. It's come about in recent times for those of you that aren't familiar, and it comes from managerial academia. And what VUCA is used to describe is exactly that, the broader operating environment that we're all in at the moment, globally. It stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That is the operating environment that we're in. Disruption, yes, one piece. Technology, AI, better things and processes, different ways of doing things. But VUCA sums up all the other bigger things that all have impacts on our business today. The political environment, we've had Brexit, we've had Trump, Theresa May has recently resigned as Prime Minister. Australia in itself has had a revolving door of Prime Ministers ourselves. And with that comes changes and uncertainty in political policy. Things that all affect businesses and how businesses make decisions. Yourselves here in South Africa, you've had a change in president. You've had recent appointments of 2 new finance ministers. All of these things will impact upon how businesses will be able to run. So we can't be redefining or attempting to redefine our value without understanding that this is exactly what we're operating in. So then let's talk a little bit more about why it is that customers choose to engage us. I think it's really quite straightforward. You can sum it up in 3 points. 1, there's a problem. They come to us because there is a problem that needs solving. Sometimes it's not even a legal problem. In-house people will most certainly be able to resonate with that. Oftentimes, nothing to do with legal, but hey, fix it. The second is they want someone to explain the law. So that problem might have a legal slant or compliance component to it, and they need someone to explain, well, what is the law in this area as it applies to me? And the third is the point around advocacy. Whether you're an advocate on the other side of a negotiating table or an advocate in a courtroom, or it could well be that your customer needs you to be an advocate in a boardroom to help get a point across and to get board approval. Those are the key reasons. And that's all there is to it. How often do we really sit back and take a good long think about what we're doing that really targets and addresses those very basic fundamentals for why customers engage with us? Because remember, we're all here to talk about how to increase customer engagement by adding value. Now these I've quickly summarised here for illustrative purposes why it is that I discussed briefly we chose to pursue our professions in the law. What are our motivators? What do we want to get out of the law? And then you've got your customer and what they want. And you can start to see here that, yes, there may be some alignment there, but not necessarily. Yes, there's the advocacy piece, there's the desire to help that broadly might come towards help moving and helping a customer's needs. But you'll see some of those things in our individual motivations could potentially actually conflict with what our customers need and want from us. So how do you deal with that? The way you are able to add value in this environment, in the complexity and ambiguity that is today, the way you're able to add value to a customer doing each of those things is premised on one simple thing: trust. Why trust? Because trust is what will withstand the test of time. It doesn't matter if there are processes that are improved or there's technology that replaces certain commoditizable parts of the law. It doesn't matter if there are various other things that impact upon decision making. If your customer trusts you, then you get the opportunity to value add in each of the things that they've asked you each of the things that they've engaged you for. So without trust, you don't even get the opportunity to try and meet those customer wants and needs. And so I ask you, how often do we actually think about building trust? We all say, yes, we're customer-centric and we're customer-focused, but what does that really mean? Now, before we start thinking that trust is this airy-fairy component and then how do you go about redefining your value based on trust, I'll give you something objective because lawyers love objective tests. A few years ago, 3 former Harvard professors wrote a book called The Trusted Advisor, more than a few years ago. I think it was around 2000. And in that book, they premised the notion of trust in a quantifiable objective equation. They called it the trust equation. And they say this is what you use to measure your ability to build trust. Trust equals credibility plus reliability plus intimacy divided by a denominator of self-orientation. There it is there for you to have a look at. And my very basic, mathematically not so inclined lawyer brain would look at that, and even I can see that an overemphasis on self-orientation means you're going to diminish trust. It applies in so many regards, but I think very specifically has great value in how we want to think about, as a legal profession, how we want to actually define our value. So the question I pose is, if you look at the motivators we had earlier, you can see very clearly that those things that motivate us, the things that made us decide to be in the profession and drive us today, they're all things that sit in the self-orientation denominator. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. We're allowed to be motivated by things. We're allowed to be motivated by money. They're not bad things. But the issue is an overemphasis on those things and a lack of emphasis on the things on the top. This is a very good example of what has happened to AMP in the Australian Financial Services Commission. There was clearly an over-self-orientation focus of the organisation, and that led to all sorts of issues and debilitated their ability to be customer-centric. So that's the question you need to be asking yourselves. What is your added value in the current environment that we're working in? Again, managerial terms. I've come across it in my MBA recently. They talk about value add or added value. And it applies in every simple interaction you as an individual or you as a professional can have in your career and in your life. In each interaction you have, what is your added value? What is the value you are adding in that interaction you have? How often do we think about that? What I pose is that we should be defining that value add based on the concept of building trust. Because with trust is where you'll be able to withstand all the tests of the complexity that VUCA is. You'll be able to withstand all the technology disruption that there is. It won't matter that you're dealing with health tech, reg tech, fintech, legal tech. Because trust underpins everything, regardless of where you sit in the legal industry. So let's talk about what that means. Credibility. Sounds like a really simple, straightforward concept. Credibility, in my mind, immediately goes towards basic things like qualifications, your education, capability, expertise, reputation, things that you've built up as a lawyer. But I tell you what, credibility is something that can so easily be shot when you don't focus it on what your customer wants are. You know, those 3 things we talked about. And I'll give you a very simple and funny example. A few years ago, I had to engage an external lawyer to brief on a very complex area of insurance law. And the purpose of it was we were going to redefine some of our product offerings. So something that was complex would have to go to my CEO and invariably likely go to the board as well. Very, very complex area of law, not an area that I myself had practiced deeply in. So I went to look for an external advisor, gave him all the context, he knew what the issue was. And here's an extract of the advice he gave me. I'll give you a few minutes to read it. I think it's actually a lot more fun if we read it together out loud. Finally, we comment that noting the imputing of the authorities and learnings applicable to TPD lump sum determinations, we query whether or not the current wording is in fact in the best interest of X. If in fact X is bringing to bear concepts of permanency imputed into TPD type assessments when in fact only entitlement to a month-by-month benefit is being assessed, should the insuring clause be amended to more closely reflect the type of insuring clause detailed in paragraph 3.9 above? Whew. And can I assure you that if I'd reproduced for you paragraph 3.9 above, would not have shed any further light on what this paragraph of advice is trying to get across. Now, we're all very intelligent individuals in the room. No doubt, if we sat here and read that thing 10 times over, we'd be able to deduce, maybe, what the advice is getting at. But I'm going to sound very, very obnoxious. I'm GC of a $50 billion super fund. I don't have time to read your advice 10 times, 20 times over to get it. My CEO most certainly does not have time to read that thing 10, 20, 30 times to understand it. And I would be laughed out of town if I tabled that advice to my board and tried to ask for a product change. So just like that, credibility shot. And why is that? Yes, he had the credentials. Yes, he had the quals. But were those quals relevant in his ability to deliver on what I needed as a customer? Remember me as a customer. I wanted, in that scenario, someone to explain the advice for me and potentially be an advocate for our product change internally. He didn't do any of those things. He wrote probably a pretty good piece of advice for legal people to read. That's about it. And of course this firm has also, and I'm being absolutely facetious, Kamal, but this firm absolutely has in their value statement that they're customer-centric. It's laughable. So let's talk about reliability. In many ways, simply understood in the same way credibility is, yes? Reliability in, again, management talk, they describe as the do-say gap. Say what you'll do what you'll say. It's pretty straightforward. If you say you'll deliver an advice on time, you'll deliver the advice on time. If you don't, you'll communicate why you can't deliver it on time. It's pretty basic, fundamental things. And yet I don't think we necessarily think about it. It's an assumed, and that often means when you assume things that it doesn't actually happen. I'm very, very passionate about ensuring as a legal team in-house that in order to ensure that I can always build that constant customer engagement with my business stakeholders, that we are always a reliable legal team to engage with. So as a team, we sit and regularly ensure that we're playing by the same rules. We put together a charter to ensure that this is what we stand by. And what's really important, I'll talk a little bit about this more in my session tomorrow, but what I find is when you're lawyers in the legal profession, you really aren't trained to think team. You're really not. When you grow up through school and you study, you're trying to be the very best so that you can get into the very best law schools. And that's an individual sport. It's not a team sport. When you're in law school, I don't know, the law school I went to, incredibly competitive, and you're all competing with each other to do the very best so that you graduate top of your class, so that you get your pick of all the jobs. Again, not a team sport, individual. But when you're in the working world, it is a team sport, and we haven't been equipped to be team players. I frequently describe to my team, and I absolutely adore my team, but I frequently describe to them that I'm really a lone wolf. I don't play well with others at all. But I have to, because it's a team sport, working in the world. Whether you are working as a legal software provider, whether you're an in-house legal team, I think external law firms, and I'm sorry to bash it here, but I think law firms do a bad job at playing by teams because the focus is on individual billables. So how do you ensure that you can work as a team to build reliable delivery of value? When I engage an external law firm, I'm not necessarily engaging the individual. I'm engaging the team for the advice that I need. And reliability to me means that I can go to anybody in that team, so there's no key person risk, to get the advice in a consistent way that I want. But it doesn't always happen. It often doesn't always happen. I'll give you another great example. So again, recently, I had a very complex area of trust law that we needed to go and get an external opinion on. The context was, I'd already formed a view internally for how we would need to go about making certain changes. I'd spoken with my CEO, we formed our management view on what needed to be done, and we decided that given it would definitely need our board's approval and would need to be able to explain this technical trust law issue to the board, we would get an independent advice to give the board further assurance. It's common. So we engaged an individual that we'd commonly used and who was familiar with our organisation. He knew how we were run, he understood our values, understood how we liked to work, had even met our board on a number of times. So we briefed him, and in he came. And he was awful. Awful. I mean, trust law is complex, but he was asked multiple questions by different members of the board, questions that every good board member would ask in that scenario. And he fumbled, he tied himself up in knots, he couldn't answer the questions. It was like watching a train wreck. You know, I don't know how many of you have come across that saying, I think it was from Albert Einstein, where he said, if you can't explain a complex issue to a layperson in simple terms for them to understand, you don't know your material well enough. That was this guy. And it was so disappointing because I relied on him to know his material. And here's the real kicker. Here's what really took the cake. Towards the end of the train wreck session, he got asked a question by one of our board members, and he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, it's a really complex area of law and it's really difficult to understand. Lots of people find it really hard to understand, and I'm sorry I haven't been explaining it very well, but I haven't been instructed to consider the issue in detail, so I have been somewhat unprepared." Excuse me? If you could have been in that boardroom and seen the daggers my CEO and I were shooting at this man, you would have seen World War III right there. We were livid, furious. And why? Well, not only did he demonstrate that he couldn't be reliable and know his material, but his excuse for why? Completely on self-orientation. Not at all about delivering on my customer needs. Remember, I wanted him in there in that scenario to explain. Explain. That's why I engaged him. Explain to my board this complex legal issue and act as an advocate for why our internal position should be the one that they approve. That was why I engaged him. And here he was talking about, I'm sorry I wasn't briefed, and making excuses for not knowing his material and why I was unreliable to preserve his reputation with the board. Completely about self-orientation. Needless to say, I've never briefed this guy again. He's never stepped foot in our boardroom. But again, a partner at a very large reputable firm. Things that we assume, basic principles of reliability that we really don't emphasise or think about. And again, I think it comes back to the point around team sports. I can't go to a firm and expect that if I go to each partner, I'll get the same consistent, reliable level of advice because they're not playing team sports. They don't have a mandated way of how they'll ensure they are customer-centric. Sure, they'll say they'll be customer-centric, but how are you going to do that? How many firms, how many organisations, how many in-house teams, how many tech providers sit and look under the hood and think about how they'll really add value to deliver on what the customer wants? Let's talk about intimacy, because we'd love to talk about that at a Legal Tech Fest. Isn't that cute? I almost died laughing when I saw this. For those of you that can't quite see, it's this cat that looks just like a croissant. And gosh, I love croissants. These are my dogs. That's Glinda and Elphaba and Bambi. Now you see what I'm doing here? I'm building intimacy with you as my audience. I'm giving you insight into the inner workings of my soul. I'm joking. I'm actually joking. That is not how you build intimacy, and it's thoroughly just my way of trying to get some crazy dog lady pictures in there for this conference. Absolutely not how you build intimacy. But this is where I think we get it really wrong. I think those of us that do focus on intimacy think it's the boozy lunches, the golf days, the partner club events, the big tickets to the tennis or the cricket. That's all there is when people think about building intimacy. But that's not what it is. Intimacy, in my view, is really around building empathy. What is empathy? I can guarantee you just about everyone in this room will get it wrong. Empathy is not the classic definition of, oh, I will put myself in the other person's shoes, and that is me being empathetic. No, that's not it. Because in that scenario, I'm putting me with my value sets, my judgment, my biases, my education, my way of thinking, and yes, put in that scenario where that person is in, and trying to make a decision based on me, still me. True empathy is much harder than that. True empathy is the ability to discard all of those things, discard my biases, my value sets, my way of thinking, and trying to actually take on that other person's value sets, judgments, things that are important to them, and sit in their position with that in mind to try and understand the decision making that they would make in that situation. You see the distinction? It's not the same thing, and it's much more difficult. How many of us really try and build true empathy? I'll give you a really good example of recent times where I think it's a fantastic example of our relationship with an external firm that we're working with. So I had a problem. Customer engagement piece number one. I had a particular lawyer in my team, and I love my team, I've said they're fantastic, and I wanted to build her capability in a more specialist area of law that she hadn't really touched upon. She hadn't come from that background. I have a very diverse team, and they all have different specialisations and capabilities. Now, she was keen to work on this area, but not something that you can pick up with classroom learning. So I approached 3 of our key external law firm partners and asked them, would they be open to doing a reverse secondment? Will you take one of my team and put them in yours so that they could build in the training and technical capability that I wanted her to work on? 2 of the 3 firms said no. And I don't blame them for it, I mean, understandably so. They said no because liability, confidentiality, conflicts, professional indemnity, all the things that they were concerned about. Fine. But the one firm that said yes, they were more than keen, and in fact were able to preempt a second problem that I hadn't even actually thought about, and that was, as much as I wanted to develop my team member, those of you again will all be able to understand limited resources, couldn't afford to be one lawyer down for 3 to 6 months. Stuff still needs to get done. So they offered a straight swap. We'll give you one of our junior lawyers to come in and work in your team, cost neutral, so I'm not paying a secondment fee, and they'll take on my lawyer to train her up. Now, isn't that a great example of how you can build intimacy? Not only are we understanding the workings of how their team are, and they're building the capability I need in my junior lawyer, but they have someone coming into my team to be able to really understand how we make decisions, how we think as a legal team, what our strategic objectives are as an organisation. What a phenomenal opportunity to build that kind of customer intimacy with my team. So we've talked about credibility, reliability and intimacy. These, you'll recall, are the key numerators for building trust. Now again, why? Why are we wanting to build trust? Because trust is at the pinnacle of how we stand the test of time in our VUCA environment and continue to add value so that we can drive customer engagement, which is what we're all here for. Let's talk briefly about self-orientation. It's relatively straightforward, and as I had earlier, our motivators really serve self-orientation. And again, it's fine to have these things as long as there isn't an overemphasis on them at the detriment of the things above. Now, interestingly, in that secondment example I talked about, there was a self-orientation piece there. And I think when you really transcend the complexity of how you build engagement, the way you do that is actually where you can find an alignment between your self-orientation and the needs of a customer. That's ultimately what will give you longevity. So in that secondment example, you'll see that, yes, it was cost neutral. I wasn't charged for the secondee from the law firm, but we all know full well in the long term that building that intimacy for them means that I will end up briefing out more work to them because I'll feel like they understand me better. They'll understand my team, they'll understand my business. And what does that drive? Drives money, drives the billables. And that's a perfect example of where there is the alignment. They've helped me solve my issues, they've built the intimacy sitting at the top, and they've still been able to drive what they're motivated by, and that is money and billables. If we are able to define our value in a way where there is that alignment, that's what will transcend and ensure we continue to add value as professionals. So what are you each going to do today? We have a conference of phenomenal speakers that will talk about legal technology and different ways of doing things. But I think what we need to really think about is how do we ensure we increase those numerator factors and not overly focus on our self-orientation. I would pose to each of you that at the end of the conference, with all the material that you'll have jammed into you, if you were to go and sit away at your desk and map out all the tasks that you do in a week, list out everything that you do for your customers, the work, the everyday, whatever it is, and see how many things you can categorize in each of these criteria. Because this is how you be client-centric. This is how you add value. This is how you ensure you continue to increase customer engagement. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that because we're so caught up in our day-to-day and getting our tasks done and just getting things through, that there isn't a lot of the work we do that sits within these categories. So I would challenge you to go back, have a think about these things, try and map out what you can do to ensure you're building trust. Because increased trust is increasing value, which is increasing engagement, which is, as we said, what we're all here about today. I don't think I necessarily have time for questions. I can see that I've run out of time and over-talked to you all. But these are my contact details. I'll be floating around the conference, more than happy to chat to each of you, or if you want to reach out, more than happy to have a conversation. Thank you very much.